This is Daniel Dickinson for UN News. An estimated 500,000 people from the Roma minority perished in Europe during the Holocaust, but their persecution under Nazi rule is still widely ignored today, according to an expert on the issue. Pavel Doghi, Senior Advisor on Roma and Sinti issues for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, says the Roma people should finally receive the justice they deserve. Mr. Doghi attended a United Nations Holocaust Memorial event at UN headquarters in New York, where he spoke about the importance of education to help fight racism and discrimination against vulnerable minorities. UN News' Ana Carmo started by asking him about the fate of the Roma under the Nazi regime.
It was a similar fate as of the Jewish people, because besides the Jewish people, Roma were also specifically targeted for extermination on racial grounds. They were considered subhumans, Untermenschen, impure, a danger for the blood pool of the Aryan master race.
How does this reflect in the Roma and Sinti and their lives today in our society?
I would go back a little bit before the Holocaust. Roma arrived on the European continent approximately 1,000 years ago, and they were met with reluctance, fear, and then soon they were persecuted. There's a history of slavery in many countries. I'm from Romania. Roma were slaves for 500 years there, and only liberated like 170 years ago. And liberated meant they were set free to go without possessing anything, uneducated, in poor health, unskilled for professional labor, and so on. So there is a history of exclusion, persecution, and oppression, and it also culminated with the deportation of Roma and their killing during the Holocaust. There is still an issue with the proper recognition of the Roma Holocaust. It's often called a forgotten Holocaust because it's not widely known, and both states and historians and scholars, they were not very open to document the situation of Roma and acknowledge the suffering of Roma and their experience as being an integral part of the Holocaust. Even nowadays, the Holocaust definition focuses primarily on Jews, and then any other group is mentioned secondarily. Within the Roma community, this hurts because we always believe that what happened to Roma, what happened to us, is an integral part of the Holocaust. And I've mentioned that today, that it's time for justice for Roma to be done, and maybe that Holocaust definition to be corrected and amended to properly reflect the Roma as being part of the Holocaust.
What do you think is the reason why this was never properly acknowledged? There was like lack of documentation?
Of course there's a lack of information, but I would rather say this is more about power play. Roma were always weak, on the fringes of society, uneducated, without their own organizations to self-represent themselves politically, and so on. So it was easy for a group that is traditionally considered marginal to be just ignored. But decades after decades, more of the Roma survivors, they slowly opened up and spoke about their experience during the Second World War. And then a number of Roma activists and advocates, they have advocated for a proper recognition, and it took quite some time, at least for the Roma genocide to be recognized. But this recognition is not uniform. When we speak of intergovernmental organizations, OSCE, UN, Council of Europe, and so on, we work with different terminologies and with different commitments. For instance, within the OSCE, in the OSCE Action Plan on improving the situation of Roma and Sinti adopted in 2003 by 57 participating states, there is one chapter focusing on education, and there is one provision within that says that participating states should promote and develop teaching and educational materials about the experience of Roma during the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
So even there is no proper recognition. So it's like, there was Holocaust and then some other things happen in parallel, and that's also the case of Roma. In Council of Europe, the Roma genocide is recognized. Then the European Parliament has adopted recently a resolution that recognizes 2nd of August as the European Roma Holocaust Remembrance Day. So the terminology of Roma Holocaust is partially used by some of the bodies, but we strive for a proper and full recognition, and it's about time, 75 years after the ending of the Second World War.
Do you feel that your presence here today is part of that step that we should take forward?
I would like to believe so. And I made it very clear. Perhaps it goes a little bit beyond the formal boundaries, but I'm also Roma myself, and I would like to believe that I can express myself for what I think is just and important for the Roma people.
Can you talk on the kinds of discrimination these groups face nowadays, especially in the way that is affecting especially women and girls?
Mm-hmm. So there are different layers of exclusion and also discrimination even within the Roma community. But the biggest and the most harmful, it comes from outside, and that's historical already. There are all sorts of discriminations in every walk of life possible. And wherever you have a challenge or a bad situation, if you are to make a scale, Roma tend to or overwhelmingly are always at the very, very bottom. And that's an indication of the level of racism and prejudice. And that can be demonstrated by the kind of attitudes of the society towards Roma. That is not different whether we speak of countries from the post-communist bloc, which are still struggle with democracy and economy and so on, versus countries in the very well advanced democracies in the Western Europe. Roma are treated very often in a very similar manner, and the treatment is in no way good. If one is curious and do a little bit of a check, maybe worth of a week of media research or empirical research, if you want. So the traditional media as well as the social media, it will be very easy to find news and information about how Roma are targeted with hatred and hate speech. From the top politicians, from presidents of the country to prime ministers to foreign ministers. They go out and say all stupid and racist things about Roma, and very often with impunity. And the kind of impunity that exists already in Europe, it only emboldens the far right and extremist groups who see a top politician being outright racist without consequences. Why should they be shy? So they are encouraged to go out and express their intolerance and extremist attitude towards Roma, and that takes very often the form of racially motivated violence and incidents. Every year we document situations of attacks, pogroms, collective punishment, popular justice done by people who think it's absolutely okay to take justice and law in their hand and harm Roma.
How can education change
all
these behaviors and thoughts?
The conventional education is not an indicator for that, because schools throughout Europe are not reformed, and the educational process and curriculum and so are not reformed enough to educate the younger generations beyond the substance of the courses, but educate them about the society and about respect for diversity. So maybe some countries are more advanced, and you may see different treatment with regard to other groups and minorities or religious minorities. But the problem is that when it's about Roma, the treatment is unfortunately very similar throughout Europe, and it's one of rejection. We are here for 1,000 years in Europe, and people still call out for Roma to go back to India. So they were never considered organically as being part of the countries where they were born and living for centuries, and that's a huge problem.
Is there anything else that you think it should be covered in this interview?
Setting the proper tone is essential, and I made a call and I urged states and politicians to be responsible in their doing, because the way they set the road, that's how the policies will be implemented, or the kind of policies that many have fought for decades and now they are in place and there are in principle sound policies. They never stand a chance for proper implementation, because that requires political will, that requires putting money where your mouth is. With regard to Roma, in the past 15 years or so, maybe 30 countries have developed and adopted Roma inclusion strategies, and many were already renewed twice or even 3 times. But if you would like to draw the line and see, okay, these are in principle good strategies, if most of the measures and provisions contained by these strategies will be implemented, by now we will speak of a much better situation. The real problem is that it's all talk and it's very little that it's done.